A lonely millionaire hires a woman to pretend to be his wife for a week, but as the final day approaches, she makes a surprising decision that catches him completely off guard, leaving him in shock. Samuel Langley sat alone in the large study of his sprawling estate, a glass of aged whiskey resting in his hand. The walls around him were adorned with fine art, and the grand fireplace crackled softly in the background. Yet none of it mattered. Despite the wealth and luxury that surrounded him, he felt an unshakable emptiness. His estate, a place that should have felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage. His days were spent in isolation, with only the hum of the household staff to break the silence. No friends, no close family. His life was a collection of transactions and appointments, but there were no genuine connections. The sound of his phone vibrating on the glass table broke his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw the name of his personal assistant, Claire. She had been working with him for years, and while she was efficient and always professional, they shared no bond beyond the formalities of work. He swiped to answer. "Mr. Langley, you've been invited to the prestigious Crestmore Charity Gala next weekend. It's a high-profile event, and it would be in your best interest to attend. The board members have specifically requested your presence," she said, her tone as crisp as ever. Samuel didn't need to hear more. The gala was exactly the type of event he had avoided for years. The charity, its donors, and the endless small talk with people who only seemed interested in his wealth. He could already feel the suffocating weight of it. He'd never been one for the superficial nature of those gatherings, where appearances were everything and the conversations revolved around status. Yet, he had always felt obligated to attend these events. Not because he cared about the causes or the people, but because his wealth required it. A thought flickered through his mind, fleeting at first but then slowly taking shape. He wasn't a fool. He knew his reputation as a solitary, elusive billionaire preceded him. His privacy was well guarded, but in the circles he moved in, it was noticed. Whispers had circulated for years about his lack of a family, his unmarried status, and the general absence of a significant other. He had no illusions about how others saw him, an isolated man who had everything but the one thing money couldn't buy: connection. "I'll go," he said finally, setting the glass of whiskey down. "But I need to have someone with me. I don't want to be the lonely millionaire again." "Of course, Mr. Langley. I'll arrange for you to have a companion," Claire responded, not questioning him for a second. She was used to his eccentricities. Though this was a new request, Samuel leaned back in his chair, staring at the fire as his thoughts wandered. A companion. He could have asked one of his staff members to accompany him, but that would have been far too obvious. No, he needed someone who could play the role of his wife, someone who would fit the image of the perfect couple without drawing too much attention. It would need to be temporary, just for a week. The thought of a week with someone at his side, playing the part of a wife, seemed like the answer to his problem, at least for a little while. The days that followed were spent in a quiet frenzy as Claire researched potential candidates. The ideal woman would need to be elegant, presentable, and most importantly, capable of pretending to be someone she wasn't. Samuel wasn't picky about the details. He needed a woman who could blend in, play the role convincingly, and most importantly, not ask too many questions. It wasn't until a late Thursday afternoon that Claire finally presented him with a suggestion. "Emily Matthews," she said, her voice laced with the air of finality. "She's an actress, young, charming, and currently struggling. She's been looking for any opportunity to get back into the spotlight, and this could be exactly what she needs." Samuel stared at the photo of Emily Matthews on the screen in front of him. She had striking features, dark hair, bright eyes, and an elegance that seemed to radiate even in the simplicity of her headshot. There was something about her expression that struck him. She wasn't overly glamorous, but she had a warmth, a natural charm that made her approachable. She looked, in a word, convincing. "I'll hire her," Samuel decided. "Have her come over tomorrow. I'll discuss the details with her." The next day, Emily Matthews arrived at the estate, looking slightly nervous but composed. She was dressed casually, but her professional demeanor showed that she had done her homework. Samuel had already been briefed about her situation. She had once been a rising star in local theater, but had fallen out of favor in recent years. This gig, while strange, was an opportunity for her to make a name for herself again. The money was good, and the timing couldn't have been better. She'd accepted the job without much hesitation, knowing that it would only be a week. They met in Samuel's private study, the same room where he had sat in solitude the night before. Emily listened as Samuel laid out the details of the arrangement. She would pretend to be his wife at the charity event and at several private dinners with donors and business associates. They would maintain the appearance of a happy, successful couple, and for all intents and purposes, she would be Samuel's wife. The week would end when the event did, and she would be free to return to her life. "You're not to speak about this to anyone," Samuel added. "There's no room for error. The act needs to be flawless." Emily nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She had done similar jobs in the past, playing a variety of roles, usually for brief theater productions or as part of a promotional campaign. But this was different. She wasn't just pretending to be someone. She was pretending to be Samuel Langley's wife. She didn't know much about Samuel except that he was wealthy, reclusive, and well-known in certain circles. The details didn't matter. She was here to do a job. "Understood," Emily said, offering him a polite but slightly reserved smile. Samuel didn't expect much from her, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet determination that made him wonder if she would be able to pull it off. There was a professionalism in her posture that gave him confidence, and as the details of their arrangement settled, Samuel realized that, for the first time in a long while, he was looking forward to something, even if it was just for a week. Emily arrived at Samuel Langley's estate on a crisp, early afternoon, the vast grounds and the grandeur of the house taking her breath away. She had seen pictures of it before, but nothing prepared her for the real thing. It was a world of wealth she had never truly experienced, an oasis of privilege. As she stepped out of the car, the driver who had brought her from the city opened the door, and a staff member, elegantly dressed in a dark suit, greeted her with a polite nod. "Ms. Matthews, welcome. Mr. Langley is expecting you. Please, follow me." As they walked toward the entrance, Emily tried to suppress the fluttering in her chest. The house was quiet, its sprawling halls silent but imposing. She could sense the opulence in every corner, the polished marble floors, the ornate furniture, and the flicker of chandeliers in the high ceilings. Everything was pristine, almost unnervingly so. She had done plenty of jobs before, acting in short commercials or portraying minor characters in films, but this was different. This was a role that required a level of finesse she wasn't entirely sure she possessed. She was not simply playing a character. She was stepping into someone's life, someone's very private world, pretending to be his wife for a week. Inside, she was ushered to the formal dining room where Samuel waited. He was sitting at the head of the long, polished table, a glass of water in front of him. His presence was imposing, his posture straight, and his gaze direct but not unkind. He stood as she entered, offering her a brief but formal handshake. "Emily, thank you for coming. I trust the journey wasn't too difficult." She nodded, a practiced smile on her lips. "No, not at all. Thank you for having me." Samuel gestured to the seat across from him. "Please sit. I trust you've reviewed the details I sent you." Emily sat down, trying not to feel like a fish out of water. "Yes, everything seems clear. I understand the basic expectations, but I'm happy to go over anything again." He didn't waste any time. "You'll be accompanying me to various events, dinners with business associates, and some private gatherings. It's essential that we maintain the appearance of a married couple, supportive and affectionate. You'll be my wife for the week, nothing more, nothing less. There are no personal details you need to know beyond that." The directness of his words caught Emily off guard, but she kept her expression neutral. She knew better than to ask for more information. It wasn't her place to delve into Samuel's personal life, especially when he was being so closed off about it. "I understand," she said carefully, wondering if he had any idea how difficult it would be to pull this off without even the slightest background on who they were supposed to be as a couple. She knew how to act, But without any personal connection, the role felt hollow. Over the next few days, the act began in earnest, and Emily found herself in situations that tested her patience and ability to stay composed. Samuel's house was filled with guests, most of them business acquaintances and wealthy benefactors who clearly revered him. But there was no warmth in the air, no genuine affection between Samuel and the people around him. They all played their parts, smiling and exchanging pleasantries, but the undercurrent of formality was palpable. In public, Emily was the picture of the perfect wife, smiling, attentive, and supportive. She laughed at the right moments, made small talk with the other guests, and never let her guard slip. But Samuel remained distant, his responses measured, his interactions strictly professional. They engaged in rehearsed conversations, each exchange calculated and impersonal. When the evening events ended, they would retire to separate parts of the house, where Emily would be left alone in a guest room, her mind reeling from the emptiness of the role she was playing. Samuel was a man of routine. His days were meticulously planned, and there was little room for spontaneity. Emily found herself walking the fine line between playing her part and staying true to herself. She was, after all, a professional actress. She could pretend to be anyone for a short time, but this was different. There was something about Samuel that felt impenetrable, a coldness that seeped into everything he did. The dinners they attended were always stiff, with long pauses in the conversation as Samuel exchanged pleasantries with other guests, rarely offering anything personal. He barely looked at her during these events, and the silence between them became almost unbearable. But there were moments, fleeting and unspoken, when Emily caught glimpses of something beneath his composed exterior. A subtle vulnerability in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, a slight tremor in his hand as he set his wine glass down. At it was only during their quieter moments, away from the public eye, that Emily began to sense the cracks in Samuel's carefully constructed persona. There was a loneliness in him, an isolation that was more than just physical. It was in the way he stared at the fire in the evenings, lost in thought, or how he avoided looking at her when they sat across from each other at dinner. It wasn't just the silence that spoke volumes, but the unspoken things that lingered in the air. One evening, after a particularly long gala, Emily found herself walking back to the estate with Samuel. The night had been long, with endless conversations about business and wealth, and Samuel had barely spoken to her the entire time. He had smiled at the right moments, nodded when appropriate, but the real Samuel, whoever he was, remained hidden behind a wall of detachment. As they approached the front door, Emily, unable to hold back any longer, spoke. "You know," she said, her voice soft but direct, "this whole thing is strange. We're supposed to be a married couple, but you barely speak to me. We're both just going through the motions." Samuel's face tightened for a brief moment, but he said nothing. They stood in silence, the cold night air biting at them. "I'm just trying to do my job," Emily continued, her voice a little more forceful now. "But I'm starting to wonder if there's more to this than what you're telling me." Samuel remained silent for a long while, his gaze fixed on the door. Emily couldn't help but notice how his jaw clenched, how his body stiffened at her words. She had expected some kind of retort, but he simply turned away and walked inside without a word. She followed, unsure of what she had hoped to achieve. The distance between them seemed wider now, and yet, she could almost feel the weight of his loneliness pressing down on him. It wasn't her problem, not really. She was just here to do a job. But still, something lingered in the air, a curiosity, a sense that this man was far more than the reclusive millionaire he presented to the world. As the week wore on, Emily found herself increasingly drawn to the complexity of the man she was pretending to be married to. She had always believed that the wealthy were simply different from the rest of them, that they had everything they needed and more. But Samuel Langley was a reminder that wealth could never replace human connection, and that no amount of money could fill the emptiness that lay within him. The charity event arrived with the kind of pomp and circumstance Samuel had come to expect. The grand ballroom was filled with glittering chandeliers, flowing champagne, and laughter that bounced off the high ceilings. The air was thick with the hum of conversation, the mingling of powerful people who all wore their masks with the precision of professionals. Samuel stood at the center of it all, his tall figure striking in a perfectly tailored suit, but he felt like an outsider, as he always did in these settings. Emily, on the other hand, was a breath of fresh air in the room. Her charm was effortless, and her quick wit soon had people laughing. She navigated the crowd with ease, playing the role of Samuel's loving wife as if it were second nature. Her grace and light-hearted demeanor were exactly what the evening needed, and Samuel found himself momentarily forgetting how stiff and distant he'd been with her in private. As the evening wore on, their interactions began to shift. No longer were they the rigid, carefully curated couple they'd been at the start of the week. The more Emily spoke, the more Samuel found himself loosening up. She laughed at his jokes, encouraged him to speak about his work in a way that felt less like a performance and more like a conversation. For the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of genuine connection. Emily wasn't just playing her part, she was making him feel something he hadn't felt in years: real human interaction. The event was going smoothly when Emily noticed the tension in Samuel's posture. His movements had become more deliberate, his smile slightly forced as he interacted with yet another wealthy benefactor. The smile he gave the crowd was all polished perfection, but Emily saw the subtle cracks in his demeanor, an imperceptible tightness around his eyes, a flicker of discomfort as he excused himself from one conversation and then another. "Do you need a break?" she asked, leaning close enough for only him to hear. Her tone was light, playful even, but it carried a layer of concern. Samuel glanced at her, surprised by her perceptiveness, and then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A moment of peace wouldn't hurt. They slipped away from the crowd, making their way through the ballroom and out onto the balcony. The night air was cool, and the city stretched out below them, the lights twinkling like stars. The sounds of the gala had faded into a distant murmur, leaving them in a rare moment of privacy. "Do you do this often?" Emily asked as she leaned on the railing, her gaze following the path of a few distant cars below. "Pretend to be someone else, I mean?" Samuel let out a quiet laugh, but there was a weariness to it. "I don't pretend. I just don't let anyone in." She turned to him, sensing the shift in his tone. "Why?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he ran a hand through his dark hair, his gaze directed at the ground. "You know what they say about wealth. People treat you differently, and eventually you start to believe the lie. That you're above it all. That you don't need anyone. And then, when it's too late to change anything, you realize you've built a life where the only thing that's real is the money." Emily studied him for a moment. "That sounds lonely." "It is," he admitted, his voice softer now, less guarded. "I've spent years building walls around myself. At first, it was to protect me from people who wanted something. But somewhere along the way, I forgot why I started shutting people out. It became easier to keep everyone at a distance. And now, I can't remember how to let anyone in." Emily didn't know what to say. It was a truth she hadn't expected from him. Samuel Langley wasn't just a lonely billionaire. He was a man who had been worn down by his own isolation. In the brief silence that followed, she felt a deep, unspoken understanding pass between them. She wasn't there to fix him or offer him advice, but for the first time, she felt like they weren't just playing parts anymore. "I know what you mean," Emily finally said, her voice low. "I've always wanted to be an actress, you know? I've done a lot of small roles here and there, but nothing that ever really stuck. I've spent most of my life pretending to be someone I'm not, trying to make a name for myself in a world that doesn't always care about people like me." She paused for a moment, letting the words hang in the air before adding, "But I'm not really sure who I am anymore. Not when I'm always pretending to be someone else." Samuel turned toward her, studying her for a long moment. He didn't say anything at first, as if weighing her words, and then he spoke, his voice quiet but filled with an unusual sincerity. "Maybe we're both just trying to find a way to be seen, not for what we have or what we can do, but for who we actually are." The conversation hung in the air, its weight heavier than anything they had spoken about in the week they'd spent together. Emily felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for him, a realization that he wasn't just a man of wealth and power, but a man who had long ago lost the ability to connect with others. And in that moment, she understood something about Samuel that she hadn't before. His loneliness was not just a byproduct of his wealth, but a consequence of his own choices, the walls he had built to shield himself from the world. For the first time during their week together, Samuel looked at her and smiled, not the practiced, polite smile he often wore, but something that reached his eyes. It was a genuine smile, one that softened the harsh edges of his face. Emily felt a shift in her own heart, as if, in this fleeting moment, they had both crossed an invisible line from strangers to something more, something unspoken but real. "I don't know what to do with all of this," Samuel murmured, his eyes fixed on the city lights. "But I think I'm glad you're here." Emily smiled back, the tension between them easing. "I'm glad I'm here too, Samuel." The moment lingered, comfortable and unexpected. They were no longer just a man and a woman pretending to be married. They were two people who, for the first time, had connected on a level neither had anticipated. And though the week was nearly over, and the role they were playing still had to be maintained, Emily knew that something had shifted between them. What began as a simple job had evolved into something more complicated. Something that neither of them was quite ready to face just as the days wore on. The lines between the charade and something more began to blur. Emily had arrived at Samuel's estate with clear boundaries. This was a job, nothing more. Yet, as the hours passed and they spent more time together, the boundaries started to feel less like a defined structure and more like something fragile. Something they both constantly tiptoed around, unsure of when it might collapse. Samuel had always been reserved, but now Emily found herself in situations where his stoic demeanor began to falter. They spent evenings together in the quiet of his expansive home, where there were no cameras or guests, only the distant sounds of the estate's vast grounds. Samuel would often invite her to sit with him after dinner, offering to pour her a glass of wine or asking her opinion on a book he had been reading. On one of those nights, after a particularly long day at a charity luncheon, they found themselves in his study, the room heavy with the scent of aged wood and leather-bound books. Samuel had asked her to help him pick out a gift for his mother's upcoming birthday, a task that should have been simple but somehow turned into a long conversation about their childhoods. Emily hesitated at first, unsure how much she was willing to reveal. But Samuel's quiet persistence and the easy way he listened soon coaxed her into speaking about her past. She talked about growing up in a modest apartment with her single mother, about the early struggles of her acting career, and how sometimes she felt like she was just one failed audition away from losing everything. Samuel listened without interruption, his gaze softening as she spoke. She noticed the way his expression shifted when she mentioned the loneliness she'd often felt, how even her successes in acting hadn't made her feel truly seen. It was a vulnerability in her that he seemed to understand all too well. "You're more than what people see on the surface," Samuel said quietly, his voice low. There was a sincerity in his words that made Emily look at him in a way she hadn't before, different from the way she had seen him as a business associate or the man paying her to play a role. In the days that followed, small moments of connection began to accumulate. Samuel began to make gestures that, while subtle, suggested that he was starting to care about her more than just as an actress playing his wife. One evening, after a particularly long day filled with back-to-back meetings and events, he insisted on taking her out for a private dinner at a restaurant he frequented. It was a rare thing for Samuel to want to step away from the public eye, but he did it for her, and it left Emily with a strange, unfamiliar feeling in her chest. During their meal, Samuel asked about her dreams outside of acting, a question that seemed almost out of place given the circumstances of their relationship. "What would you do if you could do anything?" he asked, his eyes studying her face as if trying to read between the lines of her carefully constructed persona. Emily didn't expect such a question. She paused, feeling the weight of it. "I'd open a small theater, somewhere quiet, just a place where people can escape for a while. Watch a play, hear a story, lose themselves in something real." Samuel seemed thoughtful for a moment, as if he hadn't expected such a simple, yet profoundly personal answer. "Sounds like a good dream," he said, his voice surprisingly warm. As the evening wore on, the conversations grew deeper, shifting from the mundane to the more intimate. Samuel shared bits and pieces of his own life, his estrangement from his family, the years of business dealings that had made him wealthy, but had also pushed him further into isolation. Emily listened, fascinated by the layers of complexity that Samuel had kept hidden from the world. And with each passing day, those layers peeled back, exposing more of the man behind the cold, aloof exterior. But with each moment of connection, Emily also felt a growing sense of conflict. She had signed up for a job, not a relationship. She had agreed to pretend to be someone else's wife, not to be the emotional crutch for a lonely man. Yet, in the quiet of their private conversations, in the way he looked at her when she laughed or offered her opinion, she couldn't deny the growing attraction she felt toward him. It wasn't just his wealth or the position he held. It was something more subtle, more human. It was his vulnerability, the quiet desperation in his eyes when he spoke of the isolation he had spent so many years cultivating. It was the way he smiled when he caught her off guard with a thoughtful comment, as if he were revealing pieces of himself that no one else had seen. And then there were the small gestures that made her heart race. His hand brushing hers when he handed her a drink, the fleeting moments when their eyes would meet and hold for just a second too long. Samuel didn't openly flirt with her, but Emily knew that something was shifting between them. His affection was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and it made her feel something she hadn't expected. She found herself torn between keeping the act professional and allowing herself to feel what had been growing between them. It was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to be a job. But with each passing day, the boundaries between the act and their real emotions seemed to melt away, leaving something new in their wake, a tension that neither of them knew how to handle. Emily tried to push the feelings away. She reminded herself that this was a job, that Samuel was a client, and that the emotions she was beginning to develop were dangerous. She couldn't afford to get attached. But the more she resisted, the more the pull toward him grew. Samuel, for his part, remained guarded. He was still the reclusive billionaire who kept people at arm's length. But Emily couldn't help but notice the way he sought her out in moments of quiet. She caught glimpses of the man he was trying to hide, a man who wasn't just wealthy, but deeply wounded by the choices he had made and the life he had built around his own emotional walls. They both knew that the clock was ticking. The week was drawing to a close, and soon, the charade would be over. But the tension between them lingered, a silent force that neither could ignore. Emily had started to care for him in a way she never intended, and Samuel, though still cautious, seemed to be opening up in ways he never had before. But as they both knew, this wasn't real. Couldn't be. And yet, the closer they came to the end of their arrangement, the more difficult it became to separate the act from what was beginning to feel like something more. The final days of their week together seemed to pass in a blur. What had once felt like a carefully staged performance, a role both of them played with professionalism and distance, had transformed into something far more complicated. Emily and Samuel had spent so much time together, both in public and in private, that the lines between what was real and what was a fabrication began to dissolve. They laughed over dinner, talked late into the night, and even shared silences that felt comfortable rather than awkward. The wife act had become second nature for Emily, but deep down, she knew it wasn't just a role anymore. Samuel had always been distant, but now he sought her out more often, his guarded demeanor slipping when they were alone. He'd look at her with a softness she hadn't seen before, as though he were trying to keep some part of himself hidden but couldn't help it. There were small gestures, too, touches on her arm when he passed her, a smile that lingered just a moment too long. Each time, it made Emily's heart skip in a way she hadn't expected. But as much as the connection between them deepened, there was still the looming knowledge that it would all end. The week was almost over, and their arrangement, their charade, would come to a close. Emily couldn't ignore the sense of loss she was already beginning to feel, even before the final goodbye had come. The thought of walking away from Samuel, of never seeing him again, gnawed at her. What had started as a simple job had turned into something more profound, something that made her question what she had been hoping for all along. She had promised herself that she would keep her distance. After all, this was just a job. Samuel was paying her for a role she'd played before, pretending to be someone's wife for a short time. But now she wasn't so sure. Had it always been just a job? Or had she allowed herself to get too close? What would it mean for her to walk away? She spent her last night with Samuel in his study, as she had on so many evenings before. They were alone, the rest of the house silent around them. Samuel sat across from her, a glass of wine in his hand, but his eyes weren't on the glass. He was looking at her, his expression unreadable. She could feel the weight of his gaze, and it made her pulse quicken. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice quiet, measured, "about what comes after. What happens when this is all over?" Emily swallowed, unsure of where the conversation was headed. "Well, I'll go back to my life. You'll go back to yours." Samuel nodded, but there was a certain tightness to his expression. He set his glass down and leaned forward slightly. "But this week, this wasn't just a job for you, was it?" Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her voice steady. "What do you mean?" He continued, "this connection between us, it wasn't just part of the act. Not for me, at least." There it was, the admission she had been waiting for, though she hadn't expected it to come so soon, so abruptly. She had felt it, of course. She had felt the pull between them, but hearing him say it aloud was something entirely different. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't know how to respond. "I never wanted to admit it," Samuel went on, his eyes darkening. "I've spent so much of my life building walls, protecting myself. But with you, it's been different. I've let myself feel things I didn't think I could anymore." Emily's heart raced, and she tried to steady herself, but her emotions felt all over the place. The rational part of her wanted to pull back, to remind him that this was just a temporary arrangement, that it wasn't real. But the other part of her, the part that had connected with him on a deeper level, felt her own walls begin to crumble. "I don't know what to do with this," he said, his voice rough now. "I'm afraid. I don't know how to be vulnerable like this. It scares me." The words hit her harder than she expected. Samuel Langley, the powerful, wealthy man who seemed invincible to the outside world, was afraid. She had always seen him as someone untouchable, someone who held everything together with an iron grip. But now, in this small moment, she saw the cracks, the vulnerability that had been hidden beneath the surface. "I get it," Emily said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "I get why it's hard. I do." Samuel's eyes searched hers for a moment, as if he were trying to understand something he couldn't quite grasp. "You don't have to stay, you know. Once the week is over, you can go. I won't try to stop you." She smiled, a sad, almost resigned smile. "I know." For a moment, they both sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Emily's heart was aching now, torn between the connection she had felt growing and the knowledge that it couldn't last. Samuel was a man who had built his life around control, around distance, and she couldn't imagine him giving that up so easily. The next day, the final day of their arrangement, felt like it lasted forever. The farewell was inevitable, but neither of them knew how to make it feel like anything other than a painful ending. Emily could see it in his eyes. He knew the charade was coming to an end, but he didn't know how to let her go, and neither did she. By the time evening arrived and the final event of the week loomed, Emily was barely holding it together. Her heart was a mess of conflicting emotions, and she knew that she couldn't keep pretending anymore. The moment she had been dreading was approaching, and all she wanted was to do something that might change everything. When the final toast was made at the event, and the guests began to disperse, Emily found herself standing at the edge of the room, looking out over the lights of the city beyond the grand windows. She had played her role perfectly, but now she wasn't sure she could keep pretending that it was all just a job anymore. The line had blurred too much. Samuel came up behind her, his hand brushing her arm lightly. She turned to face him, and there it was again, the pull between them, stronger than it had been before. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence was heavy, but it was also filled with everything they hadn't said why at in that moment. Emily knew what she had to do, but it would be the last thing he would expect. The final day arrived with a heaviness that Samuel couldn't shake. Despite the wealth, the status, the countless rooms in his sprawling estate, it all felt so small in comparison to the emptiness that had begun to fill him since Emily arrived. He had grown accustomed to her presence, her laughter, her warmth, the way she made him feel something other than cold and distant. In the early days, he had tried to maintain the walls he'd spent a lifetime building around himself, but she had slowly chipped away at them, and now, standing on the edge of the last moment they'd share, he felt a deep sense of loss settling in his chest. As Emily packed her things, preparing to leave, Samuel's mind raced. He had spent the last few days reflecting on their time together. What had started as a simple business arrangement had morphed into something neither of them had anticipated. The distance he had kept between himself and the world seemed to evaporate when Emily was around. She had softened his edges, made him laugh, forced him to confront parts of himself he hadn't realized he'd hidden away for so long. He couldn't let her go like this. The idea of losing her, of returning to the life he had before she came into it, was unbearable. He had come to rely on her, more than he'd ever expected. And as the hours ticked by, the realization hit him harder than he could have prepared for. This wasn't just about their arrangement. He wanted more. As she zipped up her suitcase, he stood at the doorway of the room, watching her, unsure of how to begin. He wasn't the type of man to make grand declarations, but in this moment, he felt as if he had no choice. "Emily," he began, his voice quieter than he intended. She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't know how to say this," he continued, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "But these past few days, they've meant more to me than I thought they would. I appreciate everything you've done, not just for the act, but for the person I've become because of it." Emily's expression softened, though she didn't speak right away. Samuel continued, his words coming out in a rush now, as if they had been building up inside him for too long. "I know this was a job for you, a way to make some money, but he hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I'm starting to realize that I don't want this to end. I don't want to lose you, Emily. Maybe this doesn't have to end like it was supposed to. Maybe we could try something real, without the charade." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Emily said nothing. Samuel watched her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt so exposed. This was not the man he had been before. He wasn't asking for a temporary arrangement anymore. He wanted her, not as his wife for a week, but as someone real, someone who mattered. Emily's eyes flickered with surprise, but then she gave him a small, almost wistful smile. It wasn't what he expected. She walked toward him slowly, her suitcase forgotten for the moment. "Samuel," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I never expected you to say that, and I never expected to feel the way I do now." He took a step closer, his heart aching with hope. But Emily raised a hand, stopping him from getting any closer. "But there's something I need to tell you, something you're not going to want to hear." Samuel's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "You don't have to leave, Emily. We can make this work, I know we can." Her smile faded, and she shook her head slowly, her eyes suddenly filled with something he couldn't quite place. "It's not that simple, Samuel. I do care about you. I really do. But not the way you think." His chest tightened, his breath catching in his throat. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I care about you because you're a human being, and we've shared something real," she said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability she was revealing. "But I can't keep pretending that I'm the person you need. I can't keep pretending that we're something we're not." Samuel felt his heart sink, the words landing like a blow. He opened his mouth to speak, but Emily held up a hand, her eyes searching his with a mixture of sympathy and something else, regret, perhaps. "I've been offered a role, a real one, not just some fake act, but a chance to do what I've always wanted, to be someone else for a while, and I'm taking it. I've already decided." Samuel stood there, frozen. He couldn't quite process what she was saying. You're leaving?" "Yes," she said, nodding slowly. "I am. And as much as I care for you, I can't be the person you want me to be. Not for this. Not under these circumstances." A wave of frustration washed over him. "But this is real, Emily. This," he gestured between them, "this connection we have, it's not just a game. It feels real to me." She looked down, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. "I know it feels real, and maybe it is in some way, But it's not real enough. You're still hiding behind your wealth, behind your walls. I can't be a part of that anymore. Not if it means I'm just another role in your life." Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He felt as if the ground beneath him had been pulled out from under him. "So what? You're just going to walk away? After everything?" "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "I'm walking away, not because I don't care, but because you need to learn how to form real connections, Samuel. Not with money or contracts, but with people who don't need to be paid to be a part of your life." Samuel stood there, staring at her, his mind racing. Everything he had built his life around, the money, the control, the walls, was crumbling in front of him. He had thought that this act, had been the answer to his loneliness. But now he realized that the answer was not a role-playing wife, but someone who could see him for who he really was and still walk away. He was left standing in the room, the sound of Emily's footsteps fading as she turned to leave, and in that silence, he was left with the harsh truth of her words. Samuel stood there, motionless, his mind still reeling from Emily's words. The silence that followed her departure was deafening. He stared at the spot where she had stood moments before, as if hoping she might reappear, her soft voice filling the air with the warmth he had grown to rely on. But there was nothing, only the hollow, aching emptiness of a man who had lost something he hadn't fully realized he needed until it was gone. Her words echoed in his mind, each one cutting deeper than he could have anticipated. "I'm walking away," she had said, "not because I don't care, but because you need to learn how to form real connections, Samuel." The simplicity of it was staggering, the raw honesty something he had never encountered in all his years of wealth and solitude. People had always wanted something from him, money, favors, status, but Emily had wanted nothing. She had come into his life, not for the luxury, not for the facade, but because she had seen through it, and in the end, it was her truth that had shattered his world. The fact that she had chosen to walk away, not out of anger or cruelty, but because she believed in him enough to make him face the truth, left him shaken. The last thing he had expected from her was this, a lesson in human connection, delivered not with anger or frustration, but with quiet resolve. It wasn't just a rejection. It was a mirror held up to his life, reflecting back all the choices he had made that had led him here, alone and untouched by the world around him. Samuel walked to the window and stared out at the vast estate that surrounded him. The sprawling lawns, the distant tree line, the grand house, all of it had once felt like a fortress, a sanctuary that protected him from the pain of emotional connection. But now, as he looked out, all he saw was emptiness. The life he had built for himself, this monument to wealth and success, felt hollow. What was the point of all of it if it had left him isolated, disconnected, unable to form the bonds that truly mattered? He thought back to the week they had spent together, the laughter, the quiet moments, the way Emily had looked at him with such understanding in her eyes. She had never seen him as just a millionaire, a man to be admired or envied. She had seen through that to the person beneath, and in doing so, she had shown him a part of himself that he had long ago buried. The lonely man behind the wealth, the man who yearned for connection but was too afraid to admit it. His thoughts turned inward as he grappled with the weight of her departure. Could he change? Could he learn to reach out, to let go of the walls he had spent decades building around himself? He wasn't sure, but he knew one thing for certain. He didn't want to go back to the life he had before. The life that had been a series of hollow interactions, transactional relationships where nothing was real. It was strange, the way it had all unfolded. Emily had come into his life to play a part, to pretend to be someone she wasn't. And yet, in doing so, she had become the only real thing in his life. She had been the only person to show him that there was more to life than wealth, more to relationships than the superficial bonds he had formed over the years. And now, as he stood in the silence of the house, he felt the weight of that truth crashing down on him. He couldn't help but wonder if it was too late for him to change. He had lived so long in his self-imposed isolation that the idea of reaching out to others, of forming real connections, felt almost foreign to him. But Emily had shown him that it wasn't too late, that change was possible, if only he was brave enough to take the first step. As the hours passed, Samuel found himself moving through the house in a daze, unable to settle into any one place. He wandered from room to room, but there was no comfort to be found. He could still feel the presence of Emily in the space, as if her energy had imprinted itself on the walls, in the corners, in the very air he breathed. His staff went about their work, but Samuel barely noticed them. He had always kept a certain distance from them. After all, they were just employees, people he paid to do their jobs. But today, their presence seemed almost like a reminder of how disconnected he had become from everything that truly mattered. He had spent so many years building his wealth, collecting possessions, surrounding himself with luxury, and yet none of it had ever truly brought him happiness. None of it had ever filled the void inside him. The sound of a doorbell broke him from his thoughts, and he felt an almost instinctual reluctance to answer it. He had nothing left to give, no more pretenses to uphold. But when he opened the door, it was his housekeeper, who handed him a small note. It was from Emily. "Samuel, I don't expect you to understand now, but you'll find your way. This is the hardest thing I've ever done, but I believe you'll find what you're looking for. Take care of yourself, and know that this was never about you being wrong, just about learning to be true to yourself. I hope, in time, you'll realize that the connections you need are not bought, but earned. Goodbye, Emily." Reading the note, Samuel felt the sting of her absence like a physical ache. But at the same time, there was something else, something small but unmistakable. It was a flicker of hope, buried beneath the layers of confusion and regret. He had a chance now, a chance to do things differently. Emily had given him the space to grow, to learn from his mistakes. For the first time in years, Samuel felt the stirrings of something like determination. It wasn't clear what the future held, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't remain the same man he had been. Emily's departure had opened his eyes, and though he didn't know how to fix everything, he knew that the road to change would start with the realization that he wasn't as alone as he had once believed. As he placed the note down on the table, Samuel Langley made a promise to himself. He would find a way to connect. And someday he would be the kind of man who could look back at this moment and know that it had been the turning point, the place where everything began to change. Months had passed since Emily's departure, but Samuel's life had slowly begun to change in ways he hadn't expected. The vast estate that had once felt like a fortress now seemed less like a sanctuary and more like a cage, its rooms echoing with the sound of memories, moments that, while fleeting, had left a deep imprint on him. Emily's absence lingered in the air, but it was no longer the suffocating presence it once was. Instead, it was the quiet reminder of everything he had come to understand about himself, the uncomfortable truth that he had to face. Samuel had started small, volunteering at local charities, helping with events that had nothing to do with his wealth, his name, or his status. It was a world he had never truly inhabited before, and at first it had felt strange, almost alien. He had always been the one to make the checks, to sponsor the causes from afar. But now, he was in the thick of it, talking with the volunteers, engaging with people who had no expectations of him beyond his willingness to participate. There was a vulnerability in it, an openness that had been foreign to him for so long. But with each day, each new connection, Samuel felt himself becoming more comfortable in his own skin. He started to see his loneliness not as a curse, but as a challenge, a part of him that he needed to confront head-on. The conversations that once seemed like obligatory exchanges now felt more like genuine opportunities to connect. He would listen with a curiosity he hadn't known he possessed, asking questions about people's lives, their stories, their passions. For the first time in a long time, he found himself paying attention to the people around him, not because he had to, but because he genuinely wanted to understand them. Reaching out to estranged family members was another small but significant step. It had been years since he had spoken to his sister, and even longer since he had made any effort to bridge the gap between them. He still remembered the last argument they'd had, a harsh disagreement that had left their relationship in tatters. But with Emily's departure came the realization that he didn't want to carry that kind of isolation with him forever. He reached out, tentatively at first, unsure of what to expect. To his surprise, his sister was willing to meet. The conversation wasn't easy. There was hurt on both sides, but it was a start. Samuel had come to realize that making meaningful connections wasn't about grand gestures or acts of charity. It was about showing up, being present, and allowing people to see him as more than just the wealthy businessman. It was about being vulnerable enough to admit that he didn't have all the answers, that he was still learning, still growing. Even though he had made progress, there were days when loneliness crept back in, reminding him of the emptiness that had once been his constant companion. But now, instead of retreating into his own world, Samuel would confront it. He would call a friend, invite a colleague to dinner, or volunteer for another event. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and for the first time, he felt hopeful about the future. As for Emily, life had moved on for her, too. She had embraced new opportunities, finding work that was more fulfilling and aligned with her passion for acting. The role she had been offered after leaving Samuel had turned out to be a turning point in her career. It was a far cry from the role she had played as his wife, but it was one that allowed her to bring a piece of herself to the stage, to portray a character with depth and nuance. The success she had found felt earned, not built on pretense. She often thought about her time with Samuel. It had been a complicated week, one filled with moments of laughter, vulnerability, and unexpected intimacy. She had left because she knew it was the right decision, but that didn't make it any easier. There were times when she wondered what might have happened if Samuel had chosen a different path, if he had been willing to take the risk of opening up to her completely. But those thoughts were fleeting. She couldn't afford to dwell on what-ifs. Instead, she focused on the present, the new friends she had made, the exciting opportunities that lay ahead. She had no regrets about walking away from Samuel, but she still carried a small piece of him with her, the lessons he had taught her, the vulnerability he had shown her. He had made her believe that change was possible, that people could grow and evolve, even if it took time. One quiet evening, as she sat in her apartment reflecting on the past months, Emily received a letter from Samuel. It was a simple note, not a grand gesture, but it held the weight of something sincere. He thanked her for the time they had spent together, for the impact she had made on his life. He told her that he was still learning, still trying to be a better person, but that he would never forget the lessons she had taught him. Reading his words, Emily felt a mixture of emotions. There was no bitterness, no longing for something that could never be. Just a quiet sense of closure, the understanding that their paths had crossed for a reason, and that their time together had served its purpose. As the weeks turned into months, Samuel continued to change. He hadn't found the perfect solution to his loneliness, but he had learned that it wasn't something to escape. It was something to be faced, understood, and ultimately embraced. He had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. And so, as the story came to an end, Samuel reflected on what he had learned from Emily. She had never truly been his wife, but in the brief time they had spent together, she had taught him more about life, love, and the power of human connection than anyone else ever could. It wasn't the life he had imagined for himself, but it was the life he had chosen, and in the quiet moments of reflection, he knew it was the better choice. As Samuel's journey of growth and self-discovery comes to an end, we see how one unexpected connection can change everything. From the lonely millionaire to a man learning to embrace vulnerability and real relationships, Samuel's story is a reminder that it's never too late to seek the connections we truly need, no matter how far we've drifted from them. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a connection that made you rethink the way you view relationships? Or maybe you've had a turning point like Samuel's where you learned something life-changing about yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and turn on the bell for updates. Let's continue this journey together. Until next time.